Let me give you a story from my own background. I lived 15 years in Nigeria, from 1961 to 1976. I was building a group of companies. In the late 1960s, I had my eye on a manufacturing company that I wanted to buy. This was during the Nigerian Civil War, when people who were much smarter than me were selling out and leaving the country. The business that I was looking at was owned by a Syrian family, and it was a company that had been losing money every year since it was established, creating a lot of discontent with the minority shareholders and the staff and so forth. I offered 10 times book value to buy this company. 3 years later, Harvard Business School wrote a case study of this potential acquisition opportunity. And the students discussed this and decided that I had been in the tropics too long. I mean, this was really dumb to consider buying this. This company was dead, buried, gone, finished. I had the pleasure of coming down to the front of the class and saying, after they had taken a unanimous vote not to buy this business, I came down and said, not only did we buy it, but we paid off all of its debts in the first year and generous dividends to me and minority shareholders for years thereafter. How did we do it? Is it a miracle? No, we simply bought imported raw materials at world market prices rather than excessive prices. The previous family had been overpricing imports for the purpose of creating a kickback that would be paid to them out of the country. We didn't do that. We bought at normal world market prices, made our profits in Nigeria, paid our taxes, triple the size of the business, and it was all great fun. Experiences like that convinced me that what I was seeing in the business of economic development deviated quite significantly from what most people were thinking about in terms of economic development. So after 35 years in the business world, I segued into the think tank community, wrote a book on this subject matter, and have been involved in addressing these issues ever since. This is the reality with which we deal. Illicit money flowing out of developing countries is about 3 times the amount of overseas official development assistance going into developing countries. We're talking about roughly, in our estimation, $1 trillion a year on average passing out of developing countries. Compare that to $120 billion of foreign aid going into developing countries. We're talking about a ratio that may be 8, sometimes 9, sometimes 10 times the amount of money illicitly coming out of developing countries as the total amount of ODA going into developing countries. This makes no sense for the developing countries or for the richer nations providing the economic assistance. Illicit money is money that is illegally earned, illegally transferred, or illegally utilized. If it breaks laws in its origin, movement, or use, it merits the label. It comes in 3 forms. The proceeds of bribery and corruption is 1. 2, the proceeds of criminal activity, such as drug trading and racketeering and counterfeiting and so forth. And 3, the proceeds of commercial tax evading activities. Now, a lot of people think that this problem of illicit money passing out of developing countries is all about corruption in those countries over there. It's all about corruption in Mohammed's Sierra Leone and other countries. In our analysis, in the cross-border flow of illicit money, I'm not talking about what takes place within the country, but in the cross-border flow of money. The corrupt component is about 5% of the global total. The criminal component is about 30 to 35% of the global total. And the commercially tax evading component is about 60 to 65% of the global total. We're intimately involved in the commercially tax evading component of these flows. Now, we utilize two economic models in developing these estimates. And we do a global analysis, we do regional analyses, and we do country analyses. The two methodologies, the two models are one, the World Bank residual method, and two, IMF direction of trade statistics. In the Q&A, I can go into more detail on those. Suffice it to say that they've been around a long time. These models have been used by lots of economists. We were the first to take these models and apply them to data for all developing countries. But we didn't invent this methodology. We simply adapted it to looking much, much more deeply into what's going on in the developing countries. We think that our estimates are conservative because our estimates are based entirely on what governments file with the World Bank and the IMF. This leaves out all of smuggling. All criminal activity is not covered in this. It leaves out certain forms of trade mispricing. It leaves out the cross-border flow of cash. It leaves out any of the calculation of the mispricing of intangibles. The IMF direction of trade statistics that we use refers only to merchandise trade. Does not have anything to do with services trade. Services trade, as a matter of fact, is about 25 or 6 or 7% of the global economy. None of that, none of the mispricing of services is included in our estimates. We think that our estimates are conservative. Having said that, we encourage others to do their own estimates, and a lot of people are beginning to do these kinds of estimates. In our judgment, this roughly $1 trillion a year that we can see, we think that we can reasonably estimate moving out of developing countries. In our judgment, this is the most damaging economic condition hurting the global poor. Now, obviously, I'm drawing a distinction between economic conditions and political or environmental conditions. But among economic conditions, we don't know of anything so harmful to the global poor as this movement of roughly $1 trillion a year out of their economies. It drains hard currency reserves, heightens inflation, reduces tax collection, cancels investment, and undermines free trade. It has its greatest impact on the global poor. What you have here are two bar charts depicting the two usual ways of measuring global income, or that is the two usual bases upon which global income is estimated. One is on the basis of currency exchange rates, and the other is on the basis of purchasing power parity. In each bar chart, each color represents 20% of the world's population. Look at how much of global income flows to the top 20% of the world's population, and how little of global income is available to the bottom 80% of the world's population. Whichever measure you use, we're talking about some 70 to 90% of global income flowing to the top 20%, leaving only 10 to 30% of income for the bottom 80% of the world's population. I want you to understand something. The flow of illicit money across borders is essentially motivated by the desire to move money from the bottom to the top, out of the hands of the 80% into the hands of the 20%, out of the countries where 80% of the world's population lives into the countries where 20% of the world's population lives. This is essentially the motivation driving this process. Okay, how does this money flow? It's facilitated by a global shadow financial system which we in the West created. This was not a system that was created by people who live in the countries out of which the money comes. It was created by those of us who live in the countries into which the money arrives. This system was developed and expanded over the last 50 years. There were a handful of elements of this system more than 50 years ago, but the great acceleration to develop the global shadow financial system took off 50 years, or about 50 years ago, for two reasons. In the decade of the 1960s. The 1960s was the decade of independence. Between the late 1950s and the end of the 1960s, 48 countries gained their independence around the world. So decolonization was a factor in driving the global shadow financial system. Secondly, it was the spread of multinational corporations around the world that took off in the 1960s and is continued today. For those two reasons, decolonization and the spread of multinationals, the 1960s marked the takeoff point in this structure. So the global shadow financial system now comprises tax havens. When I started in business in the early 1960s, there were about 4 or 5 tax havens around the world. There are now more than 60 around the world. Most tax havens function as secrecy jurisdictions, meaning that these are places where you can set up corporations behind nominees and trustees such that no one knows who owns the businesses. These disguised corporations number in the millions and millions around the world, more of them in the United States than in any other country. Anonymous trust accounts, fake foundations, falsified pricing of imports and exports is by far the most frequently used part of this structure. We created this system primarily for the purpose of moving flight capital and tax evading money across borders. Now, can anything be done about this, or is this just the reality of the way the world has come to work and there's nothing we can do about it? 2 points when we begin to talk about what can be done about it and how this may feed into the Millennium Development Goals. 2 points. First of all, the goal is to curtail this money, not to try to stop it altogether. That would require draconian measures, would not be acceptable. Curtailing it can be done with some straightforward steps that we can talk about. Secondly, curtailing the flow of illicit money across borders is a two-way street. It's not just the responsibility of the countries out of which the money comes. It's even more the responsibility of those of us who live in the countries where the money arrives. The overarching answer to this problem is greater transparency in the global financial system. That's something that I would hope that could be built into the new Millennium Development Goals, commitments to greater financial transparency. What does this mean? Give you 2 or 3 elements of what this could consist of. Number one, know who owns the entities with which you're dealing. This, in the terminology, is referred to as beneficial ownership. Know who are the natural flesh and blood people who own the accounts with which we are dealing. There is no argument in favor of not knowing with whom you're doing business. There is no argument in favor of that. And yet there are millions of such entities around the world where we don't know with whom we are doing business. Know with whom you're doing business. Require banks and financial institutions to know the natural persons owning the accounts with which that are in their institutions. Secondly, you've heard country-by-country reporting mentioned. This means that corporations should be required to report their activities for each country where they are in business. This is not the case now. Corporations can report their global results and you have no way of knowing what's the breakdown from country to country. If we were to require country-by-country reporting right now, what you would find is many corporations reporting losses in many countries around the world and huge profits in tax haven entities, tax haven subsidiaries. How do you do that? How do you lose money where you're in business and make money where you're not in business? Well, you do it with transfer pricing. You do it by doing the same thing that family did that I bought the business from. You use the pricing mechanism for the purpose of shifting money around the world. A third element of this that is needed is automatic exchange of tax information between countries. The United States and Canada have had automatic exchange of tax information for years. For the same period of years, Mexico has been asking for automatic exchange of tax information with the United States and hasn't gotten it. The European Union figured out a long time ago that it had to automatically exchange tax information among members of the European Union. Prime Minister of India at the Conn's G20 summit called for automatic exchange of tax information between major emerging market countries and the United States and Europe. These are realistic steps that can be taken, and indeed there is progress on each of these steps as we work on it. I would hope that the Millennium Development Goals, the new Millennium Goals, would recognize the importance of transparency and put some teeth into that. Can I close with one thought? The comment was made, the number of people who die from malaria, the number of children who die from malaria. Thomas Pogge has made an estimate that 18 million people a year die of economic deprivation and causes stemming directly from economic deprivation. That's 50,000 people a day. That means since we started meeting this morning, 15,000, 16,000 people have died of economic deprivation and causes stemming therefrom. I repeat what I said earlier. Among economic conditions, I know of nothing that is so harmful to the global poor as the movement of huge sums of money out of their countries, and it is almost entirely a permanent outflow. Very little of it turns around and goes back in again. This is an issue that calls for being addressed in the new post-Millennium Development Goals. Thank you.
Second of four tie-wearing individuals to speak to you today. Thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak on this. As Melissa said, I teach at the Ted Rogers School of Management, though I'm a philosopher by training, and most of my background is in moral philosophy and business ethics. So it's sort of from that point of view. It's from the point of view of someone whose concern is to teach business majors, management majors, at a very large management school about these issues that I talk, but also as someone with a background whose interests include sort of a broader range of moral philosophical issues. Just by way of outline, I'll say that the sort of five things I want to talk about. First, I'll say something brief about my topic and the role of corporations in all of this. Next, I'll differentiate two different sort of categories of corporate obligations that we might talk about. Then I'll talk a little bit about about business interaction with government and the ethical obligations that might apply there. A brief note about industry associations, and then some conclusions. So the topic that I'm going to talk about most generally is the question, do corporations have obligations vis-a-vis illicit financial flows? And if so, what are those obligations? And just to set the ground, I'll say that I take my field, business ethics, to be defined roughly as the critical structured examination of standards of individual and institutional behavior in the world of commerce. That's what business ethics is. And this topic matters for the topic of this panel because markets and corporations are phenomenal instruments for creating wealth, though not always for distributing it in any equitable way. They are truly amazing instruments, markets and corporations, but instruments endowed with a kind of agency. They are responsible for the effects of their activities, and but that is consistent with the assertion that the human beings behind corporations and who benefit from them are responsible for getting them to act appropriately. Okay, but I'm going to start with a bit of a footnote, a bit of a worry I have about the topic of the role of corporations, both in curbing illicit flows of cash and in global development more generally. And my worry is that the topic is going to become at least in some quarters, going to tend to be politicized and foster and sort of feed on general anti-corporate sentiment. I'd like to suggest that corporations, even though I'm interested, by profession, I'm interested in finding ways to get corporations to do the right thing and not to do the bad thing. And I spend my day talking about things they've done bad. I think it's important to say that corporations are not the enemy or shouldn't be here. And if they are the enemy, if they're truly the enemy, if they cannot be part of this, I think cynically we might as well all go home. Don't regret the power of corporations. We should try and harness it instead. Now, that's not to say that that's easy, but it has to be the right way to think. Corporations and markets need to be seen as mechanisms and as partners in development, though, of course, that comes with some risks. Corporations, I think, have a real interest in reducing poverty, if for no other reason than the fact that $1.25 a day makes you a lousy customer and probably a lousy employee. The problem is, for corporations, is the same as it is for individuals, which is that there's a collective action problem here. To say that corporations together as a group have an interest in having more people as eligible customers and eligible employees is not the same as saying that any individual corporation is immediately motivated to try and solve particular problems on particular days, but that's the same as for individuals in the general population. But corporations are still important partners, I think, and I think we shouldn't let a culture war over capitalism get in the way of helping the world's poor, and I think the cooperation of corporations is important to that mission, and that mission is more important. So two different categories of corporate obligations. We could break it down usefully, I think. On the one hand, there are obligations that corporations have with regard to their own behavior, their own direct actions. And then on the other hand, there are obligations concerning the indirect effects of their operations. And we should talk about them separately. With regard to corporations' obligations with regard to their own actions, I'm not going to say much about the illegal activities, right? Because I don't think you need someone with a PhD in philosophy to tell you that it's wrong to break the law, that you shouldn't be violating the law. I'll say a couple of things about the borderline stuff. I think the basic obligations for corporations in terms of curbing illicit flows of money are things like don't game the system to avoid taxes, even when you can do so legally. Often, I think corporations will try to take shelter in the idea that they've got an obligation to do what they can to minimize costs, to maximize profits, but there is no general obligation legally in most places to maximize, with the emphasis on maximize profits there. There's an obligation to take care of your shareholders, but prioritizing duties to shareholders where that is required, and that's not everywhere, is a vague enough concept to be consistent with the principled stance against tax evasion, even where taxes can be avoided legally. The second kind of point, and Mr. Baker knows a lot more about this topic and could suggest a lot more concrete examples than I can, so I'm just hitting two or three. Corporations need, and I think have an ethical obligation to be more transparent about transfer pricing. So for those of you who haven't come across this topic before, transfer pricing basically involves when when GM Canada buys or sells goods from GM Mexico, right? And they have some leeway in terms of what they say things are being, it's sort of like when you sell your spouse a car for $1, right, because it's got tax advantages. It's more or less the same thing, except that it can end up looking like or being a kind of corporate tax evasion. So they need to be transparent about transfer pricing. They need, and I think people in accounting need to be work hard at figuring out the right ways for corporations to report total taxes paid internationally in their audited annual reports. So that's one of the suggestions that the UNDP has made. And corporations should recognize that even when gaming the system is legal, it is dishonorable. They also, I think, need to have zero tolerance for bribery and kickbacks. It's easier these days for corporations to have zero tolerance because there are important pieces of law that impose on them an obligation to have zero tolerance. So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is the big scary one in the US, though Canada and the UK and other countries have similar laws. Besides being corrosive, bribery is just a lousy competitive strategy because it's a kind of underhanded, behind the scenes kind of attempt to gain advantage. Is one that the business community as a whole cannot win any individual company can hope that their bribe is going to be successful, but if it's not, they may never know why, and they certainly can't run to the cops to complain about it. Business knows this, I think, but they sometimes see things like bribery and kickbacks, which are one of the sources of illicit flows. They see it as a necessary evil. I think they need to do more to make it just an evil and make it less necessary in their operations. On the side of responsibility for indirect effects, I think it's important to recognize that major corporations, major transnational corporations in particular, support entire ecosystems of smaller businesses, subcontractors, agents, purchasing agents, and so on. And the activities there, I think, can be from, and I'm relying on other people's accounts, activities there is a major source of illicit transfers. So even if, a particular Canadian-based multinational knows that it has to stay out of trouble, it has to avoid offering bribes, there's a whole bunch of other smaller players that operate in the periphery that may not be quite so committed or quite so afraid of offering bribes. And I think corporations need to assume some responsibility for illegal and unethical activities in their shadow. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act does, to a certain extent, impose this kind of duty on corporations. They'll say, look, even if it wasn't you that offered the bribe, if it's someone who we could consider to be an agent of yours, you can get in serious, serious trouble for it. So I think corporations need to set expectations for their subcontractors appropriately and may need to be relied upon to do some training for subcontractors, even though that wouldn't traditionally have been thought of something that you would be obligated to do. And I think they need to share best standards for doing business right and responsibly. A note about business interaction with government, and I think this is a really perhaps the single hardest intellectual problem in the field of business ethics. The least controversial of all the obligations you might impose on business, the least controversial one, the sort of overarching norm for all of business, is that business should play by the rules of the game, right? And so there's it's a fairly common sentiment in business for business to say, look, government can go ahead and set some rules, make sure it's a level playing field, and then I'll play by the rules of the game. And as long as I'm playing within the rules of the game, no one should complain about my behavior. There's a hard problem, though, with regard to lobbying, right? And to a lesser extent, with efforts to advise, because sometimes governments need to ask for advice from various industry players, or to a lesser extent, perhaps with private-public partnerships. Anytime you're influencing government directly or indirectly, essentially the problem is, if you're committed to playing by the rules of the game, how should you behave when you're consulting on how the rules of the game should be changed, right? So there's a meta problem here, right? What are the rules about changing the rules? Now, I think you get some guidance here from the fundamental social role of business, which is, I think, to carry, as a philosopher, I'm not much of an essentialist. I don't tend to attribute essences to institutions. I think they serve many roles for many people. But I think the fundamental social role of business and of markets is to carry out trade in a way that builds wealth broadly conceived, okay? Very broadly conceived. And I think interaction with business should honor that mission. So I think businesses are ethically obligated not to frustrate attempts by business to keep consumers and their representatives well informed, because information is one of the fundamental components of any well-functioning market. I think they shouldn't frustrate governments' attempts to reduce externalities, which are costs imposed on innocent third parties, or to keep markets competitive rather than monopolistic, because that's another fundamental aspect of well-functioning markets. I think a further obligation for businesses is that when they're doing business in less developed countries, they must not take advantage of government's relative lack of capacity, right? It's one thing for a company in Canada to say, with regard to Environment Canada, look, you make the rules, I'll play by the rules of the game, right? And as long as I'm playing within the rules of the game, well, you've got a competent regulatory agency that sets the rules, who are we to say otherwise? I at least understand that. The same with, say, the FDA on food safety. Play by the rules of the game. That's at least a pretty good rough approximation of your obligations. But that argument doesn't make sense when you're talking about the government of Burkina Faso on transfer pricing, right? You can't just say, well, we'll follow the rules because there may not be any rules or there may not be any effective rules. Governments in less developed countries just may not have effective regulatory regimes, and so playing by the rules of the game is not an adequate defense. A last note about multilateralism in the form of action by industry associations. I think often businesses appeal to competitive pressures as reasons for engaging in dodgy behaviors. I think those appeals are somewhat muted when the behavior being sought when the behavior we'd like to see them undertake takes the form of uniform standards across entire industries, right? So you can't be at a competitive disadvantage if everyone is being asked to play by the same rules, and industry associations can foster those kinds of standards, even absent sort of high-level regulation. It's hard to call a regulatory or quasi-regulatory burden unfair when they are applied equally across a competitive domain. By way of conclusion, I'd just like to say that I think my specific comments, my comments on specific obligations here are less crucial than thinking about how to frame corporate obligations. Corporations are institutions accountable to people. As Thomas has argued, people have talking about other kinds of institutions, people have power through institutions and to do good or at least to prevent harm, and hence they have an obligation. So institutions are one of the ways that we operationalize our obligations. The question then becomes, what kind of instruments are corporations and how can we best use them to achieve goals that we believe in? So what we should really be doing, I think, is simply asking corporations to act as good capitalists. Don't undermine the social value of the free market, because if you do, you're not just hurting society, you're actually being a bad capitalist. Thank you.
Nice to know, Raymond, that you were in Nigeria when I was. I was in Nigeria from 68 to 71. But before that, I was a CUSO volunteer in Sierra Leone, and by chance I was posted to Koidu, town in Kono district, where diamonds are mined. And I got to see at first hand when I was teaching school there the chaos that goes on around artisanal alluvial diamond digging. I didn't get into the diamond thing for quite a number of years later. What I want to talk to you about, though, is diamonds as a cautionary tale in terms of this issue that we're dealing with, illicit flows. This is a real-life example of an attempt to control illicit flows, which looks pretty good on the surface, but which has some real problems. A couple of things you need to know about diamonds. Diamonds are all formed the same way. Volcanic action brings them up from the Earth's mantle. Below the Earth's mantle, you get the right combination of heat and rock and pressure, and you get a volcanic explosion. And these things are called kimberlite pipes. If you can find a pipe that's intact, that hasn't eroded, then you can dig straight down into a carrot-like chasm, haul up the gravel, sort out the diamonds, and get rich. This is an expensive process, very capital intensive. The Akati mine in Northwest Territories cost $480 million to get started. It was paid off in 18 months, so it's a pretty good business. But what's happened in some countries over 100 million years is that the tops of these kimberlite pipes have washed away. The diamonds have eroded down rivers and streams. They've become alluvial diamonds. And they're scattered over hundreds of square miles. They're often very easy to dig. They're close to the surface. All you really need is a shovel and a sieve and a strong back. There are 15 countries in Africa where you have alluvial diamonds. And these are the places where you had the most trouble during the 1990s and into the 2000s. With conflict diamonds or blood diamonds. Of course, with the end of the Cold War, rebel armies lost their patrons. The Soviet Union or the United States or its proxies were no longer available, so they began to look for other ways to finance themselves. Diamonds were one of the first. Charles Taylor in Liberia used timber, but when he saw diamonds next door in Sierra Leone, he began turning his attention there. In Angola, UNITA fueled its war with diamonds. I think something like 500,000 people died in the war that UNITA fought, buying its weapons with diamonds. From direct causes or indirect causes, diamonds and other minerals resulted in the deaths of 5 to 6 million people in Democratic Republic of the Congo, tens of thousands in Liberia and Sierra Leone and Cote d'Ivoire and other countries died as a result of these conflicts. I came back to this by accident in 1998. A number of us who'd been in Sierra Leone, or Sierra Leoneans here in Canada, began to look at this thing and try to figure out what was going on. It didn't occur to me that it was diamonds. One of the Sierra Leoneans in our group said, you know, this is about the diamonds, and until somebody does something about that, this war, which by then had gone on twice as long as the Second World War, had displaced half the population of Sierra Leone, wrecked most of the infrastructure. He said, until somebody does something about the diamonds, this will never be over. So a group of us started to study the issue. We did this under the auspices of an Ottawa-based NGO called Partnership Africa Canada. We discovered that the problem was not limited to Sierra Leone. We discovered the Angola problem. Global Witness, a British NGO, had done some research on Angola. And then we saw what was going on in the Congo and elsewhere. I don't want to talk about the campaign. I want to cut to the chase. But there was a 3-year campaign in which NGOs, a coalition grew. It got bigger and bigger and made quite a lot of racket. There was support from the UN. The UN Security Council did a study on Angola, and then I was appointed to the panel that did the study on Sierra Leone. So we had Security Council corroboration for what the NGOs were saying about diamonds. Diamonds were completely unregulated. Completely unregulated. I think something like 25% of the diamond business in the mid-90s was crooked in one way or another. This is a pretty serious accusation. If you were in the refrigerator business and 25% of the refrigerators in the world were in some way crooked, you'd be worried. For some reason, the diamond industry wasn't or didn't know what to do about it. And by crooked, or illicit, which is a nicer word for crooked, I mean tax evasion. I don't mean tax avoidance. I mean tax evasion. I mean gun running. I mean drug running and money laundering. Very serious, heavy-duty money laundering. Between 1994 and 1998, $2 billion worth of rough diamonds came into Antwerp from Liberia as Liberian diamonds. $2 billion worth of diamonds. This is a country that can't produce more than $10 million a year worth of very low-quality diamonds. Everybody in the diamond industry knows that. There's no secret about this. This was open source information. It was stuff you could get off the internet. Anybody could find it, and yet nobody was saying a thing about it. The industry was so crooked and so I mean, this was a normal way of behaving that they didn't even bother to hide it. So those $2 billion worth of diamonds, what were they? Well, a lot of them were coming from Sierra Leone. The Revolutionary United Front was taking the diamonds to Charles Taylor for weapons, helping to pay for his own rampage to power. Some of them were probably coming from Angola. Some of them were probably coming from Russia. They were coming from all sorts of illicit sources as ways of laundering money and hiding the source of these goods. When the NGO campaign got noisy enough, and of course there were other reasons, it wasn't just a noisy NGO campaign, there was a huge humanitarian problem, obvious. There were commercial interests because diamonds, gem diamonds, are only good for one thing, and they're sold on the basis of love and fidelity and beauty and all of those good things. A diamond is forever. It doesn't do to have people with their hands cut off in diamond wars. It doesn't do to hear about all the numbers of people who were killed and so on. So there were commercial interests, and there were also strategic and security interests. The cost of the peacekeeping efforts in Sierra Leone and elsewhere was enormous. And of course, it's the wealthy countries who put up most of the money for that. So there were a variety of reasons to come together and try and do something about this. The government of South Africa called a meeting to bring together NGOs and industry and governments that were concerned about this. The first meeting was held in the town of Kimberley in South Africa, very close to where the first South African diamonds were discovered in the 1860s. That one meeting led to a series of meetings to talk about how diamonds could be regulated, and that's why it came to be known as the Kimberley process. There were about a dozen meetings. First one was in May 2000. By the end of 2002, we had an agreement. Some 70 governments, including 28 covered by the European Union, agreed to something that's called the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme. So this is where you need to think a little bit about what might go into these post-MDG ideas on regulating illicit flows, because we did it. It was quite an achievement. The Kimberley process, the idea is quite simple. There's no treaty. It's voluntary. The UN was not involved. It was basically done by the NGOs and the governments and the business people who gathered at these meetings. But it was voluntary in the sense that it was going to be something that governments joined. So NGOs and industry would be observers. They had participated in all the negotiations, and they would continue to participate in the discussions and the monitoring and all the rest of it. But to be a member of the Kimberley process, you had to do this as a government. And if you were going to be a member, it was voluntary, but if you were going to be a member, you had to meet Kimberley process minimum standards. And minimum standards meant that you had to pass legislation saying that your government would abide by all of the conditions of the Kimberley process. That meant that you had to be able to have an auditable trail for the diamonds that were being exported from your country. You had to be able to audit the trail right back to the point where the diamonds were being mined, or in the case of diamonds that were being re-exported from a country like Belgium, you had to be able to track them back to the point of import. So there had to be an audit trail. You had to agree, if you were a member of the Kimberley process, that you would not allow any diamonds to be shipped from your country to any country that was not a member of the Kimberley process. So only members of the Kimberley process could receive diamonds from you if you're in. And you would not receive any diamonds from any country that was not in the Kimberley process. So Uganda is not a member of the Kimberley process. If a Ugandan arrives in Canada with diamonds, even though he has an export license from Uganda, even though he owns them legally and can demonstrate that he owns them legally, if he tries to bring them into Canada, they will be seized and he will lose them and he will face possible prison sentence. That required WTO agreement. I'm going to tell you something. I see the five-minute rule is going to hold up a 2-minute one soon. When regulators fail to regulate, I noticed in the last session that you didn't hold people to it. And what I've discovered in diamonds, when regulators fail to regulate, then you get into trouble. Now I've lost my train of thought. So in a sense, it was voluntary, but it was not voluntary. George Bush, when he became president of the United States, was starting to pull the United States out of a lot of multilateral agreements, and he certainly didn't want to join the Kimberley process. This seemed very loosey-goosey, and what is it, and why should we join this thing? The diamond industry in the United States said, listen, if the United States is not in this, we will not be able to buy diamonds. We will not be able to buy rough diamonds from anywhere. Nobody will sell to us. So obviously the United States had to be in. He changed his mind in 15 minutes once he understood it. So it's voluntary but not voluntary. You have to be in it if you have any kind of diamond industry. There were a few things missing in the basic agreement, but it went forward starting in January 2003. Went pretty well for a couple of years, and then things started to go wrong. First thing that went wrong was Venezuela. Venezuela simply dropped off the map. Venezuela is not a big diamond producer, but respectable diamond industry. I think it's about $100 million a year worth of rough diamonds come out of Venezuela. It just dropped off the radar. It was not issuing any certificates. It was not submitting its trade or production data. This is part of the obligation, if you remember. We at Partnership Africa Canada sent a team to Venezuela to find out what was going on. Diamonds were being mined. Diamonds were being exported. They were all being smuggled out of the country. The government of Venezuela had lost interest in diamonds. For them, it was a small business. Oil was everything for Venezuela. I think their management of diamonds was just incompetent, and they had lost interest. I don't think it was crooked what was going on, but it was not government. There was no government collusion in it. When we raised this at the Kimberley process and showed the evidence, the government of Venezuela got very angry about the whole thing and said that NGOs should not meddle in their constitutional affairs and all the rest of it. They said that they would stop diamond mining, they would rejig their rules, they would fix everything up, and then they would come back as a full-fledged member of the Kimberley process. We had demanded that they be suspended or even kicked out. Other members said no, they wouldn't agree. They'd given the benefit of the doubt. What the Kimberley process was doing was actually this is a regulatory system that is designed to stop diamond smuggling. In the case of Venezuela, it gave Venezuela a pass. It actually corroborated, what's the word I'm looking for? It collaborated, it condoned diamond smuggling. It's supposed to stop diamond smuggling, and it condoned it because it continued in Venezuela. We went back, reporters from the BBC and elsewhere have been back, nothing has changed. No diamonds officially are being mined or exported from Venezuela, but it's wide open. Then came Zimbabwe. And I enjoyed the discussion on human rights in the last session, but I have to tell you, if you were a member of the Kimberley process, it would sound like a debate about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. When diamonds were discovered at Marange in Zimbabwe in 2006, there was a huge rush. Tens of thousands of people rushed into the area because these are alluvial diamonds very close to the surface, easy to mine. People are desperately poor, and they want to see if they can not just get rich quick. It's not about getting rich quick. It's about just making a little bit of money. There were 1.5 million artisanal diamond diggers in Africa. On average, they earn about $1 a day. It's a horrible business. The Zimbabwean government, here was a goose that would lay a golden egg for Zimbabwe in its toughest moment, and they didn't want these people stealing their diamonds. So they sent in the Zimbabwean Air Force and basically shot the place up. 200 people were killed. There were beatings, there was rapes, there were jailings. Same thing had happened in Angola not long before that. The NGOs have been pushing for human rights inclusion in the definition of a conflict diamond. The Kimberley process doesn't want to hear about it. They absolutely refuse to change the definition of what a conflict diamond is. A conflict diamond is one that is stolen by a rebel army to try and overthrow a legitimate government. You can have as many discussions as you want about violence around diamonds. Surely this thing was created to stop violence around the diamond industry. Surely the diamond industry understands that and would agree. Well, yes, you can get quite a bit of agreement in the Kimberley process on this and from the diamond industry, but the Kimberley process works on consensus. All decisions are made on the basis of consensus. And if one country disagrees, then nothing will happen. So Venezuela disagreed that it should be kicked out. Zimbabwe disagreed that it should be kicked out, and it also disagreed that human rights should be added to the definition. So here we've got a very powerful instrument. We've got 70 countries agreeing to this. It's based on national laws. You don't have to worry about international laws. It's based on the national laws of each country. Canada passed a Clean Diamond Act, and so did the United States. And so did China and Russia and South Africa and every other country that's in there. It's all based on national laws that they have to enforce themselves. Very powerful. And yet, when it comes to dealing with non-compliance, they can't make it bite. It's got teeth, but they just can't make it bite. They've had all kinds of studies done to show that these countries and others are. I just have to tell you one more story. I've got the out of time signal already, but Guinea is a reasonable diamond producing country, and a lot of Guinean diamonds, a hefty proportion of them these days, are going to Lebanon. Lebanon said it wanted to join the Kimberley process they had a jewelry industry, and they were going to cut and polish diamonds. In fact, a lot of rough diamonds go from Guinea into Lebanon, and then rough diamonds leave Lebanon. The diamonds that go in from Guinea are industrial diamonds. They're worth mostly $10, $20 a carat. The miracle diamonds that come out of Lebanon are gem quality. They go out at $100, $200, $300 a carat. It's a miracle. I don't know what they do to treat these diamonds, but there's something really special going on. This is transfer pricing at its worst and most obvious, and a lot of it is coming out of a country where Hezbollah has got a pretty firm grip on some aspects of it. So let me conclude by saying that it's very important in working on these things. I mean, aspirations are one thing. Getting down to the brass tacks is another, and making these agreements work and following up on them is absolutely essential. I thought when we got the Kimberley process in place in 2003, the role for watchdogging, for NGOs watchdogging it, would probably be over in 2 or 3 years. And in fact, most of the NGOs that were involved in getting the Kimberley process left after a year or two thinking they had won the war. They'd won a battle, but in fact, I think they lost the war. And the jury is still out on whether diamonds will be controlled or properly regulated under the Kimberley process, or whether some other thing will have to happen. I know for one thing that the United States and some other countries will not allow the diamond industry to go back to where it was in the 1990s. You just can't have $8 billion worth of rough diamonds that are turned into $60 or $80 billion a year worth of jewelry. You just can't have that amount of goods sloshing around in the world's money laundering system. It just isn't going to happen. Every $10,000 has to be logged now. So if the Kimberley process won't do this, it'll be the Financial Action Task Force or something else that the diamond industry might not like as much as the Kimberley process. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor to be here and to share a stage with you, and Raymond, as well as my other colleague. First of all, let me thank Me Too for inviting me here. It's a very great enterprise, and I'm glad to be part of this particular endeavor. Me Too asked me to talk about how we can manage and deal with illicit financial flows within the context of Africa. So I'm going to spend some time. I think Raymond did a wonderful job of telling us, giving us a global picture. So I'm going to zero in on the African case and how do we deal with it. And he's right. Raymond is right by suggesting that it is one of the most important thing that impacts so much on the poor. For example, I'll just give you some data that Raymond's institution just produced. Since 1970, between 1970 and 2008, Africa lost around 854 billion to only two illicit financial flows. Think about it within the context of the debt that Africa countries owe. It can pay all the debt, and around 600 billion will be left for the continent to develop. So that should tell you how much. So how do we deal with this, what I call the cancer? How do you deal with this, difficulty? Within the African context, I would suggest that, and that's why the discussion about Millennium 2.0, I wasn't too thrilled with it, and then I'm also not too thrilled with the way Millennium 2.1 was discussed and the way the Millennium 2.0 is being discussed. In part because they've left out a very important dimension. That is, it's difficult for you to deal with the African issues if you don't tackle three things, and I'm going to talk about those three things. First, if you don't deal with the regional aspect, as well as the continental framework. That's the number one. Number two, if you also don't deal with the informal sector of the economy, if you don't bring in the informal sector into the picture, I don't think you'll be able to deal with the issue. And then the last one is that if you think about, if you deal with it as only a problem of government, particularly a problem of leaders, political leaders, I don't think that you'll be able to solve the problem in a comprehensive way. So I'm going to talk about these three things with the time that I have. I'll try to be as brief as I can. If you think about the way the Millennium Development Goal 1.0 was discussed, the first thing that the discussion was at the global level, so global-centric. And then, so the idea is that somehow you can get a bunch of world leaders together, and they will be able to agree on certain things that will be able to solve the poverty of someone in a village in Ethiopia. That was, and most of those individuals in the room may not have actually seen or lived poverty before, in spite of the fact that they may have come from developing country, right? Most of them may have lived in there. So that's the first. And then in terms of 2.0, The problem is that what we need to do is then to bring in the civil society. So you bring the local and then the global. What you do is that you leave the middle. And if you leave the middle, two things would happen. The first thing is that knowing from the African experience, most of these elites will pressurize and will use regional institutional mechanisms to protect themselves, to find a way out of it. And we've seen that those of you who have been paying attention, for example, within how ICC and African government are dealing will tell you that that's how they will do it. They will agree on the global arrangement, in part because it may bring them resources. And there's a very long line of thinking about extraversion. We call it, Francois Bayard called this term extraversion. The African leaders and African elite, they know how to use a language that would attract international attention to get them the resources. And then they will use the language, agree to it, and they use the language, but they will never implement it. What they will do is that they go for regional institutional mechanism to then undermine those frameworks that they've agreed within the international system. That's what they've done, a number of. So if you don't bring those regional institutions, then you are. Thankfully, both the African Union as well as a number of regional institutions have begun to develop a number of charters. And one of them that has emerged is the African Charter on Democracy, but that's not even the most important. But another one that is emerging on African Charter on Corruption. Very loose institutional mechanism. If we can focus on it and get a very good binding agreement, that is one way that you can actually bind Africans together within an international framework where they were made, and there they wouldn't be able to use this idea of ownership. We were not involved in the development of this mechanism because it is their own institutional mechanism. Second, if you leave the regional institutional mechanism, what they would do is that they will use this regional institutional arrangement as spoilers. In other words, they may not be part of the actual mechanism that undermines. But what they would do is that they would then use those regional arrangements that they have to be able to send the money across. So if you deal with it, for example, at the point of destination, what they would do is that the money will circle within the African continent. And at the moment, given the talk, within the African banking system, most of these resources are now being kept on the African continent. And one of the classic things that we realized, for example, when the Côte d'Ivoire, Laurent Gbagbo was deposed, most of his money was not actually in the West because of his relationship with France. The money was locked in Angola. And that is one of the, so if you don't deal with that, then I don't think that we'll be able to tackle the difficult. So at first, fundamental point is that I agree with the idea that we have to deal with the destination, but also have to deal with the source. And that leads me to the second point. The second point is dealing with the informal sector of the African economy. I like Raymond, I like the report a lot, but the only thing that is missing has to do with the fact that it's only measuring formal government to government. What you leave out is that you are leaving out over 60% of these transactions. We know very well that 60% of Africans are in the informal sector. And the calculation is around 30% of trade among Africans is within the informal sector. And the informal sector, what am I talking about? I'm not talking about controlling the international borders. It's easy to do it. But the informal borders between African countries. That would be one of the things that we need to think about if we are interested in dealing with this particular issue. That's where the bulk of the arrangement. And I'll give you a few data or few information to illustrate this particular point. The report that just came out, one of the things that they highlighted has to do with the fact that Nigeria is the #1 when it comes to this illicit financial flows. But the Nigerian government just commissioned a report which has just been leaked out to the BBC. And of it, the 90% of these illicit flow of money, majority of them, they end up in Eastern Europe and Singapore. And the bulk of it did not go through the former Nigerian border. It went through the informal mechanism. And so if you don't deal with it, The other thing is that if you deal with even the informal sector, you also have to deal with the informal sector within, not just across the border. You have to deal with the informal sector within itself, because one of the areas, especially in the oil sector, is manipulation of pumps, for example, and manipulation of prices at the pump itself. And that's one way that countries, African countries or African individuals have been able to transfer resources. So in other words, you can deal with it in the West or at the point of destination, but you also have to find a way to bring in the informal sector. I'm not suggesting that we should criminalize the informal sector, but we should find a way either to regulate it or to find a way to capture what they do, so that we'll be able to bring them into the formal arrangement. Let me talk lastly. Let me talk about last point about transnational network. My worry is that both in terms of thinking about the issues within the context of MDG 2.1 and then 2.0, the discussion is very government-centric. Government-centric in the sense that they think that if you can get governments to agree to this, you'll be able to manage the issue. In Africa in particular, most governments are dependent on informal governance arrangements. 60% of Africans will tell you that 60% of them are governed by informal chieftaincy institution, for example. So if you don't bring in these institutional mechanisms, you are not going to be able. And that's why I like James Obinski's point about think about government in terms of distributive leadership. And in particular, thinking about a new kind of network that have emerged and the leadership with those networks. And I'll give you one example in my own situation, because I don't necessarily work in this, on this issue, but I work in international negotiation. Very good, thank you. During the Darfur negotiation process, everyone who came to it, all those individuals were focused so much on the government. So in the room, the problem was the Sudanese government. Whilst the rebels were using the negotiation process, for example, as a way of transmitting money. So in other words, they didn't come to the negotiation table to talk and solve the problem, but they came there as a way, as a place where they could exchange money. So during the negotiation process, they had their colleagues spread out in Europe, some of them from Canada, some of them are from UK, and so on and so forth. And that is a place where they change money. So the money will come there and then they change. So in other words, they were prepared to come to this negotiation table, not to talk, but as a place where they can use to transfer money from the West here, for example, and then into to fund out the war. And that was, and any attempt to bring in both the development agencies or to highlight that the problem may perhaps not be the government of Sudan alone. He's done horrible things, but the rebels are not here to negotiate in good faith. Any attempt, because the problem was Sudan. So once you think about, the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that if you think about only in state terms, you lose out or you obscure an important element. And at the end of the negotiation process, we realize that, apart from these transfers of resources, small thing like per diem as a network was fundamental in terms of the rebels trying to push negotiation. They just didn't want to resolve it. They just wanted to use that place as a basis. The point here is that if you emphasize government, you lose an essential point. Therefore, we have to think about it in societal terms. And that's why instead of us saying that, I think I've heard the word all of government. My approach, if we are thinking about to solve this, we should talk about all of society approach in terms of dealing with it. Thank you so much.
A theme that came up really, I think, in every presentation was, drew our attention, was who can regulate these practices? Who's in a position to regulate these practices? I kept thinking, I teach political theory, and I kept thinking of, Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes. Law without the sword is mere words. the problem here is that these are trans-border flows, and we don't have a supranational entity capable of framing laws that are then enforceable. The convention approach that Ian outlined for us in the Kimberley process looked really, really, really promising until people defected, and then it seems that it's losing its bite. So one question is, on which of these issues, because there are a number of different issues here, including the money laundering issues, the diamond trade, and the flow back into conflict areas and through weapons purchasing and so on. So there are a lot of different issues. Which of these should be regulated? And Thomas also raised the question, should the focus be on trying to regulate these practices within the state from which the resources are flowing, within the states to which the resources are flowing? That those are two options for regulating authorities or powers, through self-regulation, through conventions, through things like the Global Compact that John Ruggie's been trying to advocate, a kind of best practices, norm ratcheting that eventually can have an influence on private sector actors, through regional lawmaking bodies, not a form of regulation that any of you mentioned, but perhaps there are. So there are sort of two sides to the question. Which of the issues could be captured through some sort of stable normative regime, whether it's through consensual or voluntary compliance or through formal legal enforcement? And secondly, which are the agents or forms of regulating behavior are most promising in general? Do these match up in any kind of patterned way so that we can identify steps forward? Is it best to proceed on a kind of issue-by-issue basis and say, well, on this issue, a convention approach is going to work. On this issue, actually state-based regulation is going to be more effective. So I'll just leave that to the panelists to address if they wish.
Let me just hit some of the points at which regulation can begin to work. Increasingly, the G20 is taking on the mantle of addressing these kinds of issues. The G20 has been around a long time, but it was a meeting of finance ministers. It only became a meeting of heads of state with the meeting that was held in Washington, D.C., called by George Bush, 4 years ago, whatever it was. And I think it's fair to say that the major emerging market countries that are part of the G20 have been a little bit timid the first 3 or 4 years that they've been there, and have not been putting forward their positions as aggressively as they might. We hope that that will change, and we're certainly trying to encourage that it change. We'd like to see there are, in fact, in the G20 two caucuses. There is the G8, and there is, they don't call themselves the G12, but they are the emerging market countries that are part of the G20. They do meet separately. And we're trying to encourage them to take some more aggressive positions on the question of financial transparency. Financial Action Task Force in Paris is the global anti-money laundering body. That's important. The OECD has for years, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, has been trying to regulate transfer pricing using what we think is an unacceptable approach to the problem, but nevertheless they have a large role to play in that. The Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative is important. The Dodd-Frank Amendment in the United States and steps that are being taken in the EU are moving in the right direction for extractive industries transparency accounting. You mentioned the high-level panel that Mbeki is heading in Africa. This is the first time that this agenda of financial transparency has been embraced by a continental-wide organization, and I think is having some impact in marshaling attention to this problem. And then finally, there has been talk of a convention on transparency, trying to develop a convention that is specifically pointed toward the questions of financial transparency. The possibility of a convention is complicated by the fact that most finance ministries in Europe and North America don't want it. And so the thrust for a convention on transparency is coming from development ministries and foreign ministries. But there is, in most countries that we deal with, a dichotomy between the finance ministries and the development ministries on this question. We hope that the idea of a convention on transparency will move forward, but it'll be a long-term process.
Whether it's politically feasible or not, I mean, if you're asking about international enforcement mechanisms, there's the sort of one that people may not think of, which is the U.S. Department of Justice, which, you know, doesn't sound international, but in effect is, because they're for certain issues they've shown that they're willing to. I mean, it takes, of course, an act of Congress first to give them to a law to prosecute on, but you know, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is an extremely unusual piece of legislation in that it has extraterritorial force, right? So this is a case where American government is willing to say to American companies, if you do something bad overseas, we'll come get you, right? You can't break laws, you can't break our laws overseas. And I take it that that's rooted in the fact that there is no pro-bribery argument, right? Nobody benefits from bribery. I mean, individuals can in particular cases, but bribery is bad for development, it's bad for business, and so it's not that, relatively speaking, it's not that hard to get laws passed against it. So it seems to me that a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is akin to bribery in that sense. It's a pure form of corruption. It's not good for anybody in general or for any interest group as a whole, and so there's some hope that you can have governments, individual national governments, pass laws about it and then enforce. And the most obvious, you know, the one with the biggest reach and the most teeth is the U.S. government.
I might mention the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency as well. Victor Boot, one of the most evil men of all time, serious Russian gun runner, was caught by the U.S. DEA, not by the ones that you might think. It was a sting. They wanted to get him because he was involved in shipping weapons to Colombia. A lot of people wanted him free, but he's now in a jail in the U.S. You know, EITI, Dodd-Frank, OECD, all these things are good and they're helpful and they add to the toolbox. But we already have laws against stealing. We already have laws against killing and smuggling and a lot of the things that we've been talking about here. The reason for Kimberley was because we needed something specific to diamonds because none of the other things were working. And Kimberley can work. Who can regulate? It should be made to do it. You need independent third-party monitoring. Remember, all these governments have passed laws. Legislation is on the books in 70 different jurisdictions. I mean, this is a major breakthrough. You need independent third-party monitoring. That was one thing we missed. It's peer review mechanism. Forget about peer review. It doesn't work. You need a realistic decision-making system. There's got to be some kind of a voting mechanism, maybe supermajority, but you can't be blocked. You know, we had a debate in the Kimberley process once. It went on for 2 hours as to whether the Kimberley process certificate should be on A4 paper or 8.5 by 11, and whether it should be landscape or like this. Can you imagine governments? This was to avoid a serious discussion about things. And then you need sanctions for serious cases of non-compliance. If a country is not compliant and gets kicked out, it means they can't trade diamonds. That is a serious sanction for countries that have businesses that want to do diamond business. The only one country was kicked out, the Republic of Congo, not DRC. the other one across the river because they were exporting zillions of dollars worth of diamonds, and they just didn't have an industry that was anything like that, and they were kicked out. And they were told, don't come back until you've had an independent and trustworthy survey that demonstrates to us what your geological capacity for diamond mining is. They did it eventually, and they eventually came back, and now they're a very minor exporter. It was demonstrated that it can work. Codes of conduct, global compact, all of that kind of stuff. You know, Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president described the vice presidency, his job, as not being worth a pitcher of warm spit. I think voluntary codes of conduct, there are tons of these things. The mining industry is awash in voluntary codes. They are not worth a pitcher of warm spit. If you remember the movie Pirates of the Caribbean, there's a scene in it where Captain Barbossa is going to make Jack Sparrow walk the plank. And Jack Sparrow says, you can't do that. It's against the pirate code of conduct. And Captain Barbossa said, well, I thought that was mostly guidelines. You're laughing. The audience laughs. The kids laugh. Everybody knows it's a joke. Guidelines.
Thank you. My sense is that I think we need, no doubt about it, a global compact or global agreement. But I think we need to bring in local government institutions as well. And I think that has always been a mixing link. That in most of these informal networks, at the local level, they are aware of those individuals involved. And if we can bring them into it and integrate these national, global, legislation or global, conventions, and then regional convention. That's why I like the Mbeki. I think the Mbeki process is a really, really wonderful one. If we can integrate this into local governance institutions and conventions, and then empower those local government institutions to be able to help monitor, perhaps we'll be able to deal with it in a much more effective. But the point here is that I think we shouldn't deal with it in silos. It should be linkages. It has to be linkages between, global, regional, national, and then local government level. If we don't deal with this in these linkages, I don't think that we'll be able to sort it out.
Here, let's open things up for a general discussion. I will take a list. I saw you first on the aisle there.
Awesome, thanks. It's been really interesting. I want to moderately argue the idea that bribery is bad and that's a generally accepted principle, because I think most people who have spent some time working in government in sub-Saharan Africa would know that it's not acknowledged that bribery is necessarily bad. And in fact, if you were to go and try to do work in some of those countries and treated bribery as bad, you wouldn't get very far, because there's a social and cultural component to that, both in the informal sector at a low level, that has to be addressed in a social way as a behavior change piece. And I don't think that we can say large regulatory institutions will change that. And I think that we can't ignore the small amounts of finance and informal and the bribery happening there and think that that's not going to affect how people make decisions at higher levels. So that was like one thing I kind of wanted to challenge that I didn't feel like anyone was targeting.
My point is just that there's no, from a systemic level, from a systemic point of view, there's no pro-bribery. I mean, it's not like, it's an awkward comparison, but it's not like sweatshops, right? Sweatshops actually, if all the sweatshops were gone tomorrow, it would be bad, frankly. It would be, we would all like to get rid of them eventually, but if they just disappeared tomorrow, it would just mean unemployment for a lot of people. Whereas if all the bribery stopped tomorrow, it actually would be good. Right, but there's no net gain, right? It's just a transfer of wealth from some people to others, mostly to get them to be disloyal to the people who are paying them their salaries, right? If you're talking about facilitation payments, that may be slightly different, but bribery per se, it's just not something where any economy says, gee, it would be just good if we had a little more bribery, right? Whereas there are countries that actually would benefit from having some more sweatshops. right? So it's not, there's no, at a sort of a macro level, there's no, individuals may benefit from bribery, but a system cannot. That was the point.
Let me just tell you a story about low-level bribery. You know, it's one thing at a high level. It's another thing, I think you're talking about it at a very low level. I was talking to a group of school teachers in Sierra Leone a couple of years ago, and they said, I didn't even raise the subject of bribery or corruption, but one of them said, you know, we're all corrupt. I said, what do you mean? She said, we're extorting money from the kids. She said, we have to, partly because our pay doesn't come on time or doesn't ever come. You know, we may miss 2 or 3 payrolls. But she said, in the way you get from place to place in Freetown, you take taxis. And taxis have routes. It's a bit like a bus system. So this guy goes along this road and you pay 20 cents for this route and 10 cents for that route. Everybody knows what the fare is. It's not official, but everybody knows. But they extort money. They won't let you in if you don't pay more. The reason they're doing it is because the cop is charging them money. He's holding them up for a money stop. He's doing it, and she said it's perfectly natural. She said she would do it if she was a cop. He's only earning $30 a month. And he, like they, and everybody else, would like to have a bicycle, or they would like to have clothes for their kids, or they can't afford the rice, or they might even like to have a cell phone. And a cell phone there costs just as much as a cell phone here. I think there's a fundamental problem. You know, there used to be a time when I first went to Africa, there was no internet, there was no TV, they didn't know what we had. Now they know what we have, and it's all available there, and they see a lot of people with it. And everybody would like to have it. At least they would like to have a decent life for their kids, and sometimes the only way to get it is by extorting some money, but people know that it's not a good system. People know it's not good.
Thank you. I think we should make a distinction between African elites and Africans who are working in the formal sector and those that are working in the informal sector. Those that are in the formal sector, for example, the teachers, the police officers, they have normalized what we consider to be bribery. So perhaps you can say that we need education for them. But it's not a question of they not knowing whether it's right or wrong. They know it's right, it's wrong. The only thing is that they have a way of rationalizing it because they are earning lower wages and so on and so forth. But my sense is that once you move beyond these formal and then the informal level, at the local level, I think that so many social norms and rules that are against it. So I always would want to make a distinction between those at the formal sector, and it's not politically correct to say this, but sometimes, you know, within the African context, those of us with education are the ones that are actually undermining the society compared to those poor people who are actually, in some cases, they have a number of social rules that prevent them from bribing. So we have to make that distinction. The formal level normalized, and then by the informal level, and those at the other end, they've not normalized it, and they know that it's against the rules.
The next person on the list is Joe.
I think I'll direct this question to Raymond. So I thought that was a really interesting presentation that you gave, and the question that I had to do with but I remain a little unclear about the relationship between interest and morality in your picture, and it's a lot easier to get people to go along with the right thing when the only problem is a collective action problem, that you need assurance, or you got to make sure that everybody's playing by the same rules. But it's harder if the rules are to the advantage of some and to the disadvantage of others, right? And so then the ones for whom they're disadvantageous are going to resist those sorts of rules. And I didn't get a clear picture from your overview about the extent to which you think there are powerful interests with a who have a stake in maintaining the existing set of arrangements that permit these illicit financial flows, and who they are and how they could be overcome.
Indeed, there are powerful interests that want to maintain exactly the status quo that exists at the moment. We have been not particularly successful in getting the corporate and the financial communities yet turned on to what we're talking about. I think that we have made a stronger breakthrough in the developing countries than that's perhaps not fair. We are getting traction in the developing countries on what we're talking about as the ways to address illicit financial flows. We're getting a good bit of progress in the Western countries also with, for example, in the United States, legislation to address the question of knowing the natural persons that own accounts, legislation to address extractive industry revenue reporting to developing countries. The number of things going on, automatic exchange of tax information. The United States passed what is called FACTA, which is legislation to require foreign financial institutions to report back to the United States earnings that American citizens have on foreign accounts. And of course, those foreign financial institutions are likewise requesting the same information from the United States back to them. So there's progress on all of these fronts. But there are very powerful interests that would like to slow this down as much as possible. For example, there is a move in the United States to curtail some aspects of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I think it's inexcusable, but it's true. The FCPA is under attack in the United States, led by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I think that we will succeed in heading off the worst of what is being proposed, but it does appear as though it may be weakened to some extent. If I could make a very broad comment about the financial crisis that we have been through and all of the talk about increased regulation on the financial industry and so forth, I think the financial industry has won that fight. There is not major changes in the way that the banking system in the United States and in other countries can continue to do business. There are small regulatory steps around the edges, but the banking community has basically won its fight not to have regulation significantly increased. So we've got, in any sort of process such as this, we take 2 steps forward and 1 back and hope that at the end of the day we have net progress in this business.
I want to thank the panelists for very good presentations. I have 2 points to make. The first one is a comment, and I will be interested in hearing the response from Mr. Smillie. You did a very good presentation about the relationship between diamonds and civil wars in Africa. But my concern is the definition of blood diamonds is very limited to the link between civil wars and the flow of diamonds that may be exploited illicitly. The reason why I'm raising that concern is I have an example of Sierra Leone, and from where I'm also coming from. Before the civil war in Sierra Leone, the diamonds had never been beneficial to the people. Authoritarian regimes exploited diamonds and for themselves and for a very small economic class. So the point that I'm making here is if we focus just on rebel groups and on the link between diamonds and civil war in Africa, we might end up depriving rebel groups from using diamonds to continue their war. What we may not be able to do is to use diamond to fight the war against poverty. Because in my view, it's just a matter of taking the diamonds from the hands of one bad guy to another bad guy. So if we don't tackle the issue of good governance and accountability, even if we work on the certification scheme and it is effective, as long as the diamonds remains in the hands of the authoritarian leaders, it would be beneficial to the people of Africa, and I don't see how it will be able to help with the fight against poverty. I'll be interested to get a response from you. The second point is a question, and it's for Mr. Tieku and Professor Tieku. You made a very good point that we should be careful not to criminalize informal networks. I think that's a very good point, because informal networks in Africa, and I could also give Sierra Leone as an example, they are not only a source of illicit flow of resources from Africa, they are also a source of income for people in Africa. Sierra Leone being a case in point. After the civil war in Sierra Leone, ex-combatants that were disarmed, they turned to the informal sector for jobs that government cannot provide. So my concern is, I understand that we have to regulate the informal sector, but how do we reconcile making sure that we don't deprive young people of a source of livelihood, but at the same time curtailing the inflow of illicit resources?
Your question is a good one. During the lead up to the creation of the Kimberley Process certification scheme, in other words, during the campaign period, we created a fairly large NGO coalition. I think there were 150 or 180 NGOs around the world that were available to sign petitions or do things. A number of them came into it and said, what are you doing about the environment? What about labor? What about child labor? What about all of the other things that might be wrong with the diamond industry? And we said, listen, we want to stop the wars. That is our primary aim. And if we can't stop the wars, then we'll try to do something about diamonds. And then it won't matter whether there's child labor or environmental issues. We'll try and pull the bottom out from under the diamond industry entirely. We never did that. We never went after the industry, because there are a lot of countries, very poor countries, that depend on diamonds, and there's nothing wrong in particular with what they're doing. There are 1 million cutters and polishers in India. Our aim was not to put them out of business or hurt them in any way. It was to end the war. But once we had the scheme up and running, then we began to look at this development issue. And we tried to introduce it into the Kimberley process. We talked about the 1.5 million artisanal diamond diggers and the 10 million family members that depend on them, and the fact that they're working under terrible conditions and earning next to nothing. 60% of the diamonds from Sierra Leone are mined artisanally, 100% from Congo, and it's the Congo's, DRC's biggest export. 100% from Venezuela and Brazil and Guyana, not 100 but nearly. So you've got a lot of artisanal miners. We said now's the time to start looking at the development issues and environmental issues and that kind of thing. We couldn't get the Kimberley process to address it. It's understandable. I mean, you've got members like Belarus and Ukraine and other countries that they're in it because of diamonds and their commercial interests. They're not in it for development. They don't care about that. They were persuaded to get into it just to protect their diamond industry, but beyond that they won't go. So again, the consensus problem arose. We decided to create something different called the Diamond Development Initiative. You can check it online, ddiglobal.org. The idea there was to parallel the Kimberley process, to bring together industry, civil society, and governments to work on this problem of artisanal diamond digging. These people have been bypassed by the Kimberley process. Their problem is not one of regulation. You need proper regulation, but the problem is a development problem, and it needs development solutions. They need to be brought into the formal sector. So the point Thomas made about the informal sector is absolutely essential. These people are all in the informal sector. There's no big companies. Nobody's taking advantage of them. The people who buy from them are, and the industry at large is. But there isn't a sort of a predator at their front door making them do it. And it can be done. We're finding that you can develop some generic solutions to fair prices, ethical production, environmental considerations, and also getting them into the formal sector. One of the things we did in the Congo, we took a lesson from Guyana, we said, listen, to the government of DRC, you've got to reduce the license fee for diggers. The license fee was $25. How many out of 700,000 diggers in DRC were paying that $25 fee last year, year before last? How many do you think? Not one. None. In Guyana, the fee is only $5. We got somebody from Guyana to go with us to talk to the Ministry of Mines in DRC and said, look, $25 times nothing is nothing. $5 times, let's say, 100,000 is at least something. We did a project, we got some funding for this project to try and do an experiment registering 10,000 diggers. I thought we were being ambitious, 10,000. I was worried that we'd bitten off more than we could chew. In 1 year, we registered 100,000. They want in. They want in. They want protection. They want the protection that legality gives them. It's not 100%. It never will be in DRC, but it's a demonstration that this can be done. And if people pay attention to it and try, it can be done.
Thank you for the question. I am not suggesting in any way that we should create rules that would, to some extent, undermine the economic activities of these individuals who are in the informal sector. They are there because the formal sector cannot and will not absorb them. And that's why they are there. And that's why you find 60% working in that format. What I'm asking for is to have rules that would empower local government authorities to be able to regulate these activities for the benefit of those communities. The state would want to bring them to the formal sector in their own thinking, meaning that they have to come in so that they can be taxed. The oil, so if you take the example, for example, the network, the West African network, Nigeria, Togo, Sierra Leone, for example, in terms of oil and gas export to Eastern Europe. What I'm suggesting here is that they pass through different territories, and these territories have got leaders and local government institutions all around. But they pass through it without either they will try to bribe those individuals. What I'm trying to suggest is that if we regulate them, then instead of giving the bribes to these local other individuals or maybe local chiefs who may use it for extravagant purposes, that money can go to local government institutions that can be used to build schools and so on. And that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about, right? But in our discussion, the informal sector does not appear, does not come in at all. And that's what I'm worried, that we should put the informal sector, because no one is there to, not to be Ghana-centric, but Ghana, for example, had managed to find a way to bring in, to regulate the informal sector when it comes to the mining of gold. In the past, they tried to climb down on the illegal mining, but they've succeeded in bringing some of them there, although the implementation of it is so state-centric that the politicians themselves know very well that they can't talk about it, so they never empower them. But what I'm trying to emphasize is that we should empower the local governments. Across Africa, most developing countries, are local government institutions that can be empowered and regulated so that the activities within their territory can be used for the benefit of those within that particular community.
Let me tell you a quick story about diamonds out of Africa. You've heard the term transfer pricing. That means when a corporation can sell something from one place to another and decide the price at which it wants to sell it. For a century, diamonds went out of South Africa at zero value. The diamond producers, De Beers and Anglo, more or less referred to this as gravel until it got sent overseas to be cut and polished and determined what is the value. For a century, diamond production was a state secret, and there was no accounting for any revenues from diamonds that went out of South Africa. That was changed when the majority government came into power. There is now a diamond marketing board. The last time I looked at it, the average price was $800 a carat, something like that. But think of it, a century worth of exports at zero value. I have asked repeatedly, what was the quid pro quo between the diamond exporters and the government officials concerning that? Because something had to account for that degree of cooperation between the government and the corporations that were involved in exports. And I don't know what it was. I haven't been able to get a scholar to look into that. But it would be fascinating to know what was the quid pro quo between succeeding governments and those exporters that allowed that to continue for a complete century.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Shoti Bandyopadhyay, University of Waterloo. I have never worked in this area other than what I read in the business press, but I have a couple of questions about the link between transparency and these illicit flows. Now, as far as transparency is concerned, if we think of the banking channels, certainly in US, as you have all mentioned, there's been a increase in transparency starting, even before Dodd-Frank and Corrupt Practices Act, going back to Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and then even before that, the disclosure rule that came with the savings and loans problem, the disclosure rules and so on. So there's been a tremendous increase in the level of transparency, at least in the US, which is a big financial center of the world. So because of this, if transparency really affected financial illicit flows, we should have seen a decline over time rather than we see an increase. Now the numbers, I don't know if they are in real terms or nominal, but in any case, there's been a lot of increase. So probably a lot of money is, even in Europe after 2005, the IFRS disclosure rules and so on, there's been a lot of transparency in the banking sector. But there's been, as according to the slide that was put up initially, there's been a continuous increase in those numbers. So probably it's not going to, probably it's going to other jurisdictions. So probably like low tax haven jurisdictions like Singapore and the Jersey Islands and so on. So probably, I'm not an expert, but I think probably we are quote unquote barking up the wrong tree and probably think something about equalizing tax rates. Like in Singapore, tax rates are 7 to 8%, Hong Kong 15%. Why shouldn't I park my money there if I can? So that was my first question. So where's the link?
Sorry, we've got 2 more questions after you, and
oh, that's it.
Is that okay? Was there another really urgent one?
Well,
okay, great.
Yeah, okay.
We're going to gather the last 2 questions and bundle them together with this one, and then have one final round of responses. No, I'm sorry. We've already got the queue full. So it's the person in the brown shirt in the way back there. I'm sorry. And then Gilad has the last word. And my apologies that we have to. Should we add one more question? Okay, one more question. We'll make it 3 more. Thanks.
Sure. My question will be quick. I'm interested to know what steps, if any, are happening to help develop the domestic tax system in these developing countries with respect to corporate tax, individual tax, or if it should be value-added tax. And I understand that each country would be different, but the gist of the talk, from what I understood, is the concern about monies being flowed outside of the country, but what about retention within the country from the country's own tax base?
Going back to the political challenge, so if the main political opponent, the main interest opposing an illicit financial flows goals in the post-MDGs is corporate interests, could you suggest the best political strategies to overcome this challenge, and also point to who are natural allies beyond the social justice agenda?
And the last question is from the person in the middle there. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just in a conference in Montreal where the MDGs 1.0 was celebrated greatly. And one thing that they did that really touched me was that they have involved the youth from the beginning. So my question is, what's the role of the youth beyond 2015? What's the role of the youth beyond this?
Maybe say what you do.
Okay, so I'm from Africa, Ghana, and I've started my own business called Farmerline. We provide mobile agriculture information to farmers through their mobile phone. And we won an award, World Summit Youth Award, and we're in Montreal. And youth from all over the world are taking control of their lives. They are using the skill set that they have to cause change in their environment, using the MDGs. So my question is, what's the role of the youth in this new thing that we are doing here? Thank you.
Okay, so did you want to okay, so we'll just have one final round of responses.
I'm not sure that transparency is growing. Money laundering is growing. The use of tax havens is growing. Corporate taxes are going down as a percentage of revenues for most countries. Tax burdens are being increasingly shifted onto wages and off of capital. I'm not at all sure that transparency is growing. There are regulations that are growing, and every regulation presents an opportunity to get around it somehow. So I'm not satisfied that we have reached the point where we've turned down the growth, the exponential growth in the flow of illicit money around the world. One individual has made an estimate, it was not our estimate, that perhaps 50% of trade and capital transactions globally, cross-border transactions, pass through tax havens at some point between the beginning and the end of the transaction. If that figure is anywhere near correct, that's a rather frightening figure, that the capitalist system resorts to such secrecy jurisdictions for half of its transactions. Tax systems in developing countries. I had an appointment with the head of Internal Revenue Service in 1997 in India, and he told me that his ambition was to raise the number of payers of personal income tax in India from 1 million to 1.5 million. This isn't a country of 1 billion people. Because it is so difficult to tax personal incomes, the countries that have been successful take it out of the paycheck, as we do in Western countries. But even that isn't very satisfactory, and so most developing countries have resorted to VAT taxes as a major. As customs duties have gone down, VAT taxes have gone up. Allies to address the problems of transparency, Gilad, I think the major emerging market countries represent potential allies in this. You and I talked briefly about David Cameron heading this effort. Recognize that David Cameron's first obligation is to the City of London, and the City of London receives more illicit money probably than any other part of the world. So it's going to be very tough to get and keep this on the agenda of the post-millennium development goals with David Cameron heading this effort. The youth, look what the youth did with the Arab Spring. My goodness, what an impact the youth made in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, and having an impact in other countries as well. I don't want to advocate violence. I do want to advocate advocacy and encourage you to marshal the resources of your friends in addressing the kinds of issues that we're talking about.
I think my only comment will be on the youth question as well, because I mean, on the surface, when we're talking about sort of large-scale economic questions about illicit financial flows, there's not an obvious role, but I think there is sort of to the extent to which there's a cultural question. I don't just mean culture as in individual national cultures, but different communities, whether it's parts of the financial community or parts of individual small communities in Africa. I think to the extent to which there are still places where where people think that bribery is just sort of woven into the culture and business practices. I think, as hard as it sounds, one of the things I would ask youth to do is to try to keep their youthful idealism about that, right, and not just inherit their parents' view that some things never change, or that this is just the way things are done around here, and realize that communities where corruption and bribery and illicit flows of money are pervasive are just, it's a real, I mean, the metaphor that we see in a lot of the documents is that, there are all these water metaphors that it's a drain, that money's being siphoned out, that these economies are sieves. It's not water, it's blood, right? These countries are bleeding financial resources, and I think if youth can do something to change that culturally, to keep the idealism that life doesn't have to be that way, they'll be doing their world a great service.
On the Gilad, your question about the corporates versus governments, somebody once said sunlight is the best disinfectant. So I think good research, good advocacy, a lot of PR, a lot of pushing can go a long way. But it has to be good. What I've discovered in almost 15 years working on this diamond file, a lot of NGOs are not in it for the long haul. They're really only interested in the sexy part of the battle, and then when the longer fight comes along, they just don't have the resources, either the financial or the sort of drive to keep on going. When I first encountered the diamond industry 14, 15 years ago, I'd say that it was pretty firmly rooted in Jurassic Park. It really was. I mean, their idea of corporate social responsibility was orphanages in Botswana. The Kimberley process helped to wake them up. It helped to bring them into the 21st century. And I think, despite everything I said about the Kimberley process and its weaknesses, I think the diamond industry now gets it in a way that most extractive industries don't. I think that they are much better corporate citizens in many, many ways than they once were, and than a lot of their counterparts are. The problem in the Kimberley process is governments. The reason Zimbabwe is allowed to get away with murder is because South Africa is protecting them. Good old Bob. I mean, they will not hear a bad thing said about Zimbabwe, and others in Southern Africa will rally to his support as well. You want to kick Venezuela out of the Kimberley process? Well, they've got oil. That makes it kind of difficult. The Russians have got an arms deal with them, and Hugo Chavez is a kind of a hero for a lot of developing countries. So, so political and commercial and strategic agendas have come to trump the humanitarian purpose of trying to deal with the diamond industry. It isn't so much the companies anymore; it's governments that need to be hauled out into the sunlight and embarrassed.
Okay, let me say something about the question on taxes. The first thing is that I think, in my opinion, in the immediate, what we should be thinking is strengthening tax institutions within individuals' countries. I'm saying this because if you look at the illicit flow of resources, all the countries that are on the top are the ones with very weak governments, right? And the time, any time the governments are going down, they're very weak, that will be the time that you see the financial flows. Angola, Nigeria, and Cameroon. Part of the reason being that these governments don't have the capacity to be able to negotiate with multinational corporations, for example, or haven't got the capacity to be able to collect these taxes. So that's the fact. The second thing that I think we need to do is to think about, and this will be something that when we are thinking about MDG, not just education, but the content of education that we are providing. If you look at most of the syllables around developing countries, usually there's a mismatch between what the countries themselves, the kind of thing that they need to do to be able to, and then the kind of education they are offering. And that also comes in, to some extent, is a failure of education in the sense that to have elites or someone who have gone through the university system coming out and then somehow accepting bribery as part and parcel of, or the person coming out and then thinking that the best thing to do as someone with power is to be able to drive the latest SUV and distance yourself from the community. So here, I think the point here is the content of education that we provide. The content here, the reason why the content is very important is that we need to be training people, for example, who are good at negotiating, who can negotiate with this multilateral corporation for the best deal for their country. At the moment, Nigeria, Shell owns Nigeria for around $3 billion. And Nigeria government cannot collect it because the elites were supposed to collect it. Somehow they get their share, and then Shell is able to. So that's the first point. In terms of, and then we can also, I think one thing we can also do is also encourage both the World Bank and then the IMF and international financial institutions in their dealing with the government to strengthen these governments. They have a number of people stationed in the finance ministry to help them, strengthen them to be able to negotiate with this multinational corporation. Let me touch on, in terms of the youth, there are a number of opportunities that are opening up for the youth to be able to engage. If you watch carefully within, at least on the African context, there are a number of institutional mechanisms that have now emerged. And all of them, they've got youth policy or youth-related stuff. There you can influence, and I'm shocked that if you look at the youth charter of the African Union, for example, how much space that youth of Africa have got to be able to influence their policymakers. But you go to the African Union and even ECOWAS and others, very scanty number of people who are working, extremely intelligent, I must say. But the number of African youth that are engaged in it is very limited. And especially if we're talking about a continent where 60% is under the age of 30, without proper youth or involvement, then we have a difficult. But I think the opportunities are there. We may have to, you may have to try and then take advantage of that opportunity.